Right. So I do want to apologize. We probably should have tested our ability to have the screen and mic at the same time, and so poor planning on our part. So I apologize for that. So we'll see what we do next week and certainly get better at doing what we're doing. So as is usual, I do want to take a time to pray for the needs of the community here. As well as, feel free when you are at home, naturally, you can be praying silently for the needs that you're aware of. So let's just go before our God, before the message. And so, Father, we are, we do recognize you as the great God of the universe, the personal God who seeks to meet us in the quietness of our own hearts, to minister personally to the things running in our heads, the things that we're concerned about, the things that we're dealing with, the temptation we face. Father, you care deeply about us. You care deeply about your church, and just how your people would reflect your glory and your character to the world at this time. And so I just do pray for us. I do pray for those that are more vulnerable in the context of this coronavirus. For those that are older, for those who are immune compromised, for those living with those in those situations. Father, we just do pray that your protective hand would be upon us. Father, we do pray that you would encourage us in our own responsibility, as well as just calming us in terms of the peace that you would foster in our hearts. Father, I do pray for just the economic circumstances of the congregation. I do pray that you just make a way where there is no way, that you make provision where we don't even know where it could come from or how it could happen. But Father, your hand would be upon us. Father, I do pray for our government officials. I do pray for wisdom in their decision making. I do pray that as all of us are on some level overwhelmed by the very nature of this thing, that it would be a further influence, a further push, a further encouragement for us to consider the God of the universe, to consider the gospel of Jesus Christ, to consider the cross and all that you provided for our salvation. And so, Father, I do pray that even when it comes to our government officials, statewide as well as nationally, that there would just be a general turning to you. That there would be that in terms of our nation, as the things that we would depend upon go melt away. I just pray that there would be just a further turning to the God of glory, to the God of consistency, the God of compassion, the God of mercy, the God of authority, the God of power, and we're grateful for that. I just do pray that this time that we're in, the crazy though it may be, unprecedented though it may be, that it would be just a further revelation of the kind of God that you are, the ways that you work, the ways that you minister to us personally, the ways you use us in our families' lives, in our communities, to our neighbors, whatever it might be. And Father, lastly, I just pray that you teach us how to be the church. When we think about just those that are working and those that are not, I can't help but think of the church in Acts and how those who had gave and entrusted it to those in leadership, and then that was dispersed to those in need. And so, Father, I just pray that you, just the love that we have for one another would be the mark that Jesus calls us to know that we're Christians by that love that we have. And so, Father, I just do thank you for your word. I thank you for the ways it does guide us in our life. I thank you for the passage we're in even today, just reinforcing the sovereignty that you have over all situations, over all of life. And Father, I just pray that we would be comforted by the sovereignty that you have, the control you have over our lives as well as the world. I do pray for myself that the words I speak would be consistent with your truth, and that I would have the power that I need to present your word. It's in your Son, Jesus Christ's name, that we do pray. Amen.
We're having some technical troubles with the signs, so I'm working with the people at home to tell me when it's right.
Okay. So are you going to do it to hold it like that?
Well, so far, if I turn it the other way, we lose you. So
Okay.
it's good if I hold it.
Maybe I should hold it like I do
Yeah,
in my
like a
office.
like a selfie.
There you go. All right. Well, I suppose when you're talking about communicating the things of God to God's people, shouldn't be surprised that there would be technical difficulties and disruptions. And so I did plan on this maybe being a little shorter. I'm thinking about the time frame that we're working with right now, that we started worship a little late, and that's pretty, most people don't get here until 10:15 anyway, so that's pretty consistent with Living Hope time, and we're not doing as many things as we normally do, so I think we'll still be well within the time frame that we normally would be in. But anyways, when we think about control, control really is an important element of life, independent of who you are. I mean, take my grandson Warren, because of the fact that Emily and Evan had their new baby this past week, and congratulations to them. We had the opportunity to have Carter and Warren with us, so even when you think about the control that a little Pike would have in terms of his life, and something that Warren would do is that he would take his little trucks and cars on a windowsill that's just his height, sit down on a little stoop thing that we have, and look out the window and look at the cars and trucks that were passing by. He was pointing out when they happened. And what's funny is that when he has these things assembled on that windowsill, if you walk over and take a truck or a car away, Warren gets a little grumpy. He actually gives you that look, a classic look that Warren gives you, like, why are you messing with me? And yet I think that is fairly consistent with all of us. When we think about how we order our lives, how we try to structure things to keep ourselves safe, to make our life predictable, to be able to control our environment and our circumstances and our situations, even to the extent that we try to control people around us, we just know that this issue of control is predominant, regardless of your age, your gender, your nationality, your circumstance, whatever. We all are concerned about control. And basically, when we think about just what this pandemic causes, I think more than anything else, what it does is it threatens our sense of control. The reason why people run to the store and buy piles of toilet paper or hand sanitizer, because it's a chance to try to exert some control where people feel like they've lost control. I'm even thinking of, just the things we do. Like, again, it's safety protocol, we should be doing those things, but even in doing those things, we're trying to control something that is unknown, that we really don't feel like we're in control of, and we probably do kind of have looks like Warren on our face. Why are you messing with me? And so, as we think about even our healthcare system, I think that's one area where we project a lot of control. And what we're used to in America is I have a health condition, I go to the doctor, I go to the hospital, he gives me a pill, we do a procedure, and I'm fixed, right? And so now all of a sudden happens where, boy, those quick answers, those automatic responses aren't there. And again, it's disconcerting to us when all that happens. Well, when the world seems to be spinning out of control, it is nice to be reminded that God is in control. And then the best place that we can go as believers, as, again, things are slipping away that we would otherwise want to control and we can't, that we recognize that He is sovereign. He is sovereign over everything and over everybody. So it is good to be in Romans 9, where we get a little reminder of that sovereignty that God has. But if you turn to Romans 9, remember that not everyone likes that God is in control, and not everyone likes or understands the choices that He makes. As we see in terms of the point that Paul is making in verses 10 through 13, that God's choice of Jacob was based on God's will and not on Jacob's behavior. And so basically, as God reveals that, or Paul reveals that, in terms of just emphasizing the point he's making about the people of the Jews, the people of Israel, the people of his time even, thought that what made them special to God was their behavior, the fact that they followed the law. But what Paul is saying is if Jacob was chosen, not because of his acts, but just by virtue of the fact that God chose him, then their theorizing about what makes him special is not it's not rightly oriented to God's truth. And so the common question that would result from recognizing that choice that God makes is to ask the question, is that just or right or righteous for God to do? Is it okay for God to do that in terms of making that choice? And that's what leads us to Romans 9, 14 through 18, where it says here, what shall we say? Is God unjust? Not at all. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. So therefore, what we see in terms of the overall message of Romans 9, 14 through 18, is the fact that when we really consider it, when we consider just who God is, and really if God were to be just, if God were to be righteous, none of us would be chosen. None of us would be right with God. None of us would have an opportunity to be saved. And so therefore, it's based in his mercy and his compassion that any of us has an opportunity to be saved. And that's, again, the primary message in Romans 9, 14 through 18. And so, that's what the statement is here on the screen, if you can see that. If God acted solely on being righteous and just, we would all be condemned. It is only by virtue of his mercy and compassion that any of us can be saved and be made right with him. And so basically, the reason why I'm kind of going over places where I went last week is this really is tailing into verse 19, where I want to look into it more deeply and really see the pattern that Paul's establishing for the rest of the chapter. And so basically, when we even hear what Paul says in verses 14 through 18 and verse 19, it still creates a question. One of you will say to me, then why does God still blame us? For who resists his will? So in response to 14 to 18, as it says here on the slide, Paul imagines a detractor asking another question. And that question is on the left-hand side here. If what happened to Jacob and to mankind is based in God's choices, then why are we held accountable for what we do? And so basically what we have from here until verse 29 is Paul answering that question. Basically, Paul is going to bring up 3 answers, 3 points that he will make to answer that very question. That why is it that God still blames us? Why are we still accountable for our decisions? I think it is because ultimately, even in the concept of sovereignty, our will is free. But because Paul is emphasizing God's sovereignty here, because he's engaging with this question of how does his gospel impact the Jews? What does it mean for them? That basically you can't talk about a message that comes through Christ, that comes through the Messiah, that means salvation for all the world. And when the Jews reject Christ, where do they fit? Where do they fit in this plan? What does it mean in the whole picture? And that's what he's trying to resolve in Romans 9 through 11. So the first answer that he gives in terms of answering this question, why does God still blame us? The first answer is God gets to decide why he has made us. God's sovereignty over us is based in his creation of us. So let me just read the passage here. It says here, one of you will say to me, then why does God still blame us? For who resists his will? But who are you, O man, to talk back to God? Shall what is formed say to him who formed it, why did you make me like this? Does not the potter have the right to make out of the same lump of clay some pottery for noble purposes and some for common use? Now you think about that. I mean, do you agree with that? Do you believe that? Maybe that's the first question. Yeah. Do you believe that? First, if God is a creator, does he have the right to decide what his creation is for? You know, even to the extent that we have an opportunity to be creators. We make things. We make pictures. We build something. We build a chair. We build a table. You know, what if a table went to us and started rebelling and saying, I don't want to be a table, I want to be a chair. I want to be a car. I want to be a boat. No, we expect things that we create to follow our design, to follow our purpose. Now extrapolate that to the God of the universe. where he has created everyone. There's no person in all the world that can say that God has not created me, that God has made the means for us to be in existence, and even has a will for me being here. And so therefore, the first answer Paul gives in terms of, boy, is God just to hold us responsible for our decisions? He's disqualifying the very question. We might not feel very comfortable about that as we, as Americans, think of our right to express ourselves and have our opinions and want our opinions validated and listened to. And but the first answer Paul gives in terms of engaging with the God of the universe is, really think about it. When you really question God, do you really have a right to? When you think about his authority, you think about his power, you think about all the work that he's accomplished, the good things that he has done, the reasons why we would trust him, both for the authority that he has and the power he's displayed, but in terms of his mercy, his compassion, his presence, his involvement with us personally. And so, and this answer here, again, it really hits all of us. I don't care if you're 5 or you're 50. It's important for you to decide who calls the shots? Who's the one that makes the decisions? Who's the one we're orienting our lives to? Is it me and what I think and what I want? Or am I looking to align myself with the creator of the universe? And that's really what Paul is saying here in terms of, hey, you are a creation, so who are you to question God in terms of why or how he has made you? So I think there are two sides to this in terms of this response. The first part of this response in terms of what Paul is answering, that again, God is the one that's in source, he's the one that has made you, is that on one hand, we are fearfully and wonderfully made. That you have been made for a purpose and not by accident. To know that, you wonder, why are we so different? You wonder why one person has a certain intelligence. So one person has a certain athletic ability or music ability. Well, why is that? Why does there appear to be so much inconsistency in the world? Well, because of the fact that God had a purpose for that. And so therefore, you are made and designed by a designer. You know the difference that makes in our lives? To know that we're made by a designer as opposed to the fact that we came from some goo that's just by happenstance, that things just came about and you just came out of physical existence. To know that you are a relational being, you are made by a relational being, that you are special, that to the extent that you would love people or engage with people or understand people in terms of relationship, and to know that the only reason why you can be that way is because God is that way. And he is that way to you. And so therefore, God doesn't make mistakes. When you're made a certain way, when, you're different from your brother, you're different from your sister, why does my brother understand algebra and I don't? Well, because God just has made you that way. Something that I always would tell my kids is that if you're trying to discover what you're good at, you also it has to be revealed to you what you're not good at. So therefore, if you're not a good basketball player, well, what you know is you're not going to play in the NBA. And so you don't have to worry about that. Don't focus on what you're not good at. Focus on what you are good at. And realize that most likely God has a purpose for that. I love what Barry Collin, a member of the congregation here, says, that we are a genius. All of us are geniuses in one aspect. And so therefore, that flows from our Creator. That flows from how God has made us. And so again, we're fearfully and wonderfully made. We have been made for a purpose and not by accident. God doesn't make mistakes. You're made in God's image with an indelible connection to him. And so in addition to being made by God, you're made to connect to him. That the fullness of life will only be found in connecting to God and getting to know him. And so therefore, again, that's one side of the equation. The other side of the equation, the other side of the equation is that you have no reason to complain. That is, you might complain about certain things. You wonder, you don't like how you've been made. You disagree with whatever, is, again, talents you have or what's inside you. There really is no place for that in terms of what God says here. I think it should cause us to think more deeply about alterations we might make. You think about, I would agree, and I would say that when it comes to this passage here, this isn't so much about our physical being, it's about what we've been made for in terms of purpose, and the mission that we would fulfill. And so it's more about that in terms of not questioning God about that, but to the extent it would translate to, boy, I don't like my nose, so I'm going to change my nose. I don't like this, so I'm going to change. Now, we are certainly able, in terms of our bodies, to change ourselves, to eat wisely, to exercise, and all the things that would promote health in us. But I think those things kind of come under this umbrella in terms of just God having a purpose for how He has made us, and that's the first answer that Paul gives, answering this question: why does God still blame us for the decisions we make? The second answer he gives is that God has a purpose in everything that He makes. It's just the purposes are different. God has a purpose in everything He makes, but the purposes are just different. And so look at verse 22 through 24. It says, what if God, choosing to show His wrath and make His power known, bore with great patience the objects of His wrath, prepared for destruction? What if He did this to make the riches of His glory known to the objects of His mercy, whom He prepared in advance for glory? Even us whom He has also called, not even us whom He has called, not only from the Jews, but also from the Gentiles. So you see here that as God is working His way both through disobedience and obedience, people that orient themselves to Him and those that don't orient themselves to Him, that basically it's still consistent with God being who He is. What I have here on the screen is if God blesses obedience and curses disobedience, He is still showing Himself righteous and true. And so therefore, if you take Pharaoh, and if again, the purpose that God made Pharaoh is, I'm going to display my glory through him, through his disobedience, through his hardness, that I don't think God ultimately fashioned Pharaoh for that. I think there had to be a place where Pharaoh was participating in that. We think about the examples that Paul even uses here, that the people that God is choosing against are people also that have chosen against Him. And so therefore, but I think that what God did do is that God did grease the wheels of Pharaoh's hardness, so that again, his power could be displayed. But if Pharaoh ultimately is being disobedient, if Pharaoh ultimately isn't responding to the work that God is performing around him, Pharaoh is ultimately still responsible for that, because God is just fulfilling His purpose through the decisions that He is greasing, as well as the decisions that Pharaoh was making. Say now in the midst of these verses on sovereignty, there are also expressions of free will in terms of, again, what Paul is describing here about the sovereign nature of God and just how He orchestrates things to accomplish His purpose. I mean, first of all, just look in verse 22. When it says here, what if God, choosing to show His wrath and make His power known, bore with great patience the objects of His wrath? Now, why would God bear with great patience the objects of His wrath? See, to me, that's an expression of God using His wrath to try to turn people to Him. See, that is the pattern that I see throughout Scripture. When you see the people of Israel, when you see even what God says to them, we just came through the book of Ezekiel, And the phrase that consistently is said about why God is doing what he's doing is the fact that the people would know that he is God. And so therefore, that is the point here, that the reason why God is wrathful, the reason why God is displaying his power in this way to people that are disobedient, that not only is that a way for, it's still a way for him to manifest his righteousness, it's still a way for him to manifest his power, but it's also the best way to get those people to turn or change. You know, when you even think about the book of James that we're in right now, in terms of our Bible reading, it says that God makes war against the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. And so therefore, again, that's still the dynamic of what Paul is talking about here in terms of what he's accomplishing, again, in expressing his wrath. But I believe that he's being patient here with these objects of wrath, because he's trying to use his wrath to change them, to turn them. Another thing that is significant here, when it says here, again in verse 22, what if God, choosing to show his wrath and make his power known, bore with great patience the objects of his wrath, prepared for destruction? That word prepared there is actually in the middle voice. And what that middle voice is, it's a reflexive voice where the subject is actually performing the action of the verb on themselves. And so therefore it's fitting to say that they prepared themselves for destruction. So not only is God, again, fulfilling his purpose even through those who are disobedient, that again, they will, something that's going to be on the next slide, is a question that I think all of us have to confront. Is God going to be glorified because of you or in spite of you? See, that's the question that confronts all of us in terms of the reality of these verses. That basically, if you disobey God, you shake your fist at him and say, I'm not going to believe, his righteousness is still going to be proved. His love and his mercy are still going to be proved. It'll still be shown that Jesus Christ still died for you, still paid for your sins, but because of the fact that you never came to God and believed in Jesus, then it's because of you that you didn't make that choice. As I think about the way free will and sovereignty interacts, one thing that I used to say when we used to be in the bowling league, I would say to my bowling team that, something, if God had a particular purpose for me to bowl a 300 game, I could bowl a 300 game. That every time, with my skill and my ability, and I would throw the ball whatever way that I would throw it, and something, I believe in God's sovereignty, he could make me bowl a 300 game. But for the most part, if there's not a divine purpose for God to do this, I'm going to bowl the 140s to 160s I normally bowl. And I think that is the normal way that God acts. The normal way that God acts is we make decisions, we bear consequences for those decisions. Those decisions are still glorifying God in terms of his economy. Again, whether he's judging us or whether he's blessing us. Again, whether we're drawn to God because of wrath or glory, God is still glorified in those things. And so that's normally how God acts. I just think there are rare times where God will display his sovereignty to fulfill his purposes. And I do believe Pharaoh was one of those times in terms of just the work that he was doing with his people Israel in that moment. And so I think that's the way free will and sovereignty combine for me in terms of just understanding how I'm still responsible for my decisions. They're still effective in terms of God, in terms of my life, but God is ultimately sovereign in terms of fulfilling his purposes for me. So there's, again, two sides to this, in terms of that whole idea of God has a purpose for everyone, whether you're obedient or disobedient, God can find a purpose for you. The first question we have is, what's going to draw you to Jesus, wrath or glory? You know, in other words, is it the fact that what God says is that if you don't believe in Jesus, you will suffer his wrath? You will be separated from him? You'll be separated from him for eternity? Is that the thing that's going to draw you to Jesus? You don't want to suffer the wrath of God? That's a good motivation to come to Jesus, according to what Paul is saying here in verses 22 through 24. Because that's what wrath is meant to glorify God. It's that wrath can glorify God if it draws you to Jesus. But also to see on the other side, again in verse 23, what if he did this to make the riches of his glory known to the object of his mercy, whom he prepared in advance for glory? And so therefore, as God is doing his work with those who are evil and those that are good, those that are oriented to him, those who believe, say, yes, God, I want you. I want to follow you. I see the sense and the wisdom of orienting my life to you and what you're doing in me. And so therefore, for those who recognize the compassion of God, recognize that even in terms of making the provision of salvation through Christ is an expression, a concrete expression of that mercy and that compassion. Is that going to be the thing that draws you to God? And then the second question, or again, the balance of the sides, is God going to be glorified because of you or in spite of you? Again, once again, you can't get around it. You are a created being. So the one who created you is always the reference point. Do you get that? You can't get around it. You are a created being, so the one who created you is always the reference point. You can't escape it. And so therefore, whatever you understand or don't understand about this, whatever you like or don't like about God, the best thing that you can do is to press into him. You know, one thing I do understand, one thing I do realize, and I think all of us understand this. You know, I think for everyone that's in authority, you understand how your authority can be misperceived, right? And I'm not sure if you've ever been the boss of something, and maybe you make decisions, you formulate a plan, you initiate that plan, you make things happen, and usually people that either are disagreeable or don't know you or don't agree with you, they will find reasons to attack. They'll find reasons to misalign or attack your character in terms of who you are or what you're doing or why you're doing it. And yet, you would say to yourself, boy, if they only talked to me, if they only knew me, they would know that I'm not this jerk that they think I am, that for other people that are agreeing with me and are in line with what we're doing, even in their disagreement, they'll know that I'm a kind person, a compassionate person, a sensitive person. And so I'm not sure I know I've been in that place where people who are distant in a relationship attack, and yet there's no opportunity for me to explain because there's no relationship that exists to explain. And so in the same way as we're engaging with God, it's very easy to stand away from God, to not be in a relationship with him, and just point fingers at him in terms of how we think that he's unjust, unfair, unloving, whatever. And what the God of the universe calls us to, and this is really a consistent message throughout the Word, but I think particularly here, is that whatever it is that would cause us to be drawn to God, to get to know him, to recognize our need for Jesus, to be patient with God in terms of what he's revealing and what he's doing. Like rather than letting his inactivity or activity that you don't like push you away from God, continue to engage with him to discover the God that's behind the rules. Because I would just about guarantee, I was going to put this on the human realm, definitely with God. If you pursue God in the midst of your disagreement with him, what you don't like about him, you will understand him to be the merciful, compassionate, loving God that he is. You'll actually appreciate his discipline in your life. You recognize that even that discipline comes from his love for you. But it's still, in terms of answering this question, is it right for God to blame us for our decisions? Well, I think to the extent that we participate in the work that he's doing, and even the fact that he ultimately is expressing his wrath through the choices we make, again, he is, that's the answer. That's the answer that Paul is expressing. And so in some ways, all I'm trying to do explain to you is what Paul said. And then the third answer, which is, as you can tell, is a little bit hard. But the third answer, again, there's three answers, again, and you can see what the answers are. The third answer is that it has been, that what is happening has been prophesied. I remember the main point of Romans 9 through 11 is where the Jews, the people of promise, fit in the gospel. And so therefore, as they are not following Jesus, are not pursuing Christ, are not following their Messiah, they might say, well, the gospel must automatically be wrong. How can a gospel that reaches out to the Gentiles and they're getting saved by Jesus and we're not, how can that be true? That's part of what Paul is answering here. Like, how do you fit in, Jewish people? Well, realize, again, you don't have a right to question God. If that was God's plan, that's what he wanted to do, whatever purpose he has for you. It's actually interesting in the way that Paul is describing this, that they're the ones that are the pharaohs. It's the switch that he ultimately will make in terms of if you ultimately don't believe in Jesus, you then become the people that are destined for wrath. And that's, but see, just understand the Jewish people, particularly back then, would say, no, we are the promised people. We're the chosen people. We have Abraham. We have a law. We're established in him. And Paul says, no. You have to realize that God has done a work through Jesus, and if you don't come on board, then you're going to be on the other side of it. But then their question would be, well, how is it that we could be responsible for those choices? Or how is it that these Gentiles could be saved? And the third answer that he's giving is, realize it was prophesied. He uses 2 verses from Hosea and 2 verses from Isaiah. It's actually interesting to recognize that Paul uses Hosea, for those of us who know that book, that basically Hosea the prophet was instructed by God to either, I think it was he was told to marry 2 prostitutes. And the reason for that was to show God's everlasting pursuit of his people even when they were in sin. That basically in Hosea's marriage life, he was to express what it's like for God. That as God is relating to the Jewish people, I feel like I'm engaging with a prostitute. And so he has Hosea go and marry a prostitute as a visual picture for his relationship with the Jewish people. And so, when you understand that that's even the context that Paul is quoting from in 2 of these verses, but look what he says here. Again, clearly verses that point to a greater glory, or at least an included glory for the Gentiles in terms of their receiving salvation and being the chosen people. Well, not the chosen people, but the people that would still have salvation. And it's not exclusive to the Jews. Even mentioning that in verse 24, even us whom he has called not only from the Jews, but also from the Gentiles in verse 24. But then in verse 25, as he says in Hosea, I will call them my people who are not my people. I will call her my loved one who is not my loved one. So what is that? What's he referring to? Again, in the context of Hosea, he's talking of using Hosea to express that in his life. But for the Jewish people, what is he saying? Is that as you don't follow me, as you disobey the covenant, realize when I'm in a covenant with you, a covenant is 2-sided. I promise to do what I'm going to do as God, and you promise what you're going to do as my people. And as the people of Israel continues to disobey, and then again, I think I can't remember when I make points, but just I'm doing these daily works, so I don't know where I make points. But anyways, there's a big difference between the Jewish people disobeying God within the will of God and defying God and following false gods. So I think it would be one thing for the Jewish people in terms of the covenant to say, something, we're not going to obey the Sabbath like you want, or we're not going to make, the sacrifices you want, or, I'm not going to treat my neighbor in the way that you want me to. That's a certain level of discipline. Again, it wouldn't be right. God would discipline them. God would correct. God would require sacrifices for those things, would lead them to the better way that he had. But see, what the Jewish people did is they defied God. They walked away from God. They said, you're not going to be our God anymore. Baal is going to be our God. Asherah is going to be our God. And, following the Canaanite deities and gods from Egypt and all the mess of what they created. So that is the context where God speaks to them and say, I will call my people who are not my people. Guess what? That's us Gentiles. That's us Goyim. As people would call me at Brandeis University. Not in friendly ways. That was not derogatory at all. I was actually some conservative Jews, Hasidic, Sabbath Goy, to turn on lights and off and on and so on and so forth. So it was a joy to be there. But anyways, again, I will call my people who are not my people, and I will call her my loved one who is not my loved one. And it will happen that in the very place where it was said to them, you are not my people, they would be called sons of the living God. So again, another point of transfer, another point of replacement. That, the Jews, you were supposed to be the people of God. You were supposed to be faithful. You're supposed to follow me. But you know something? When you didn't, I'm going to make a way for the Gentiles to come to me. Now, understand that part of the mission of the Jews was always to minister to Gentiles. I think something the Jews never really embraced, never really accomplished, that God in choosing the Gentiles wasn't so much not wanting relationship with other nations. He wanted people to have relationships with him through the people of Israel as they saw the kind of people the Jews were, when they saw the provisions and power that he gave them, and they never filled that purpose. But now, as they're living their lives and they're disobeying God, he's saying to them, you're not my people. But in the same context, in the same area, particularly Paul ministering in that world, when it comes to Gentiles, you're going to be called the sons of the living God. Isn't that what we are? The Jews were called sons of God, but even more so through Christ, what God has provided and opened the door for the Gentiles, really performing and accomplishing something the Jews were supposed to accomplish that they never did. So God just took it over himself in providing Jesus and then salvation to us. Not that it wasn't his plan all along, but particularly in light of the failure of the Jews in doing that. Just continuing again on this third answer, that it's been prophesied, the place the Gentiles in, the place the Jews are in terms of the gospel, is what the Bible talks about. Isaiah cries out concerning Israel, though the number of the Israelites will be like the sand by the sea, only the remnant will be saved. For the Lord will carry out his sentence on earth with speed and finality. It's interesting here that in quoting this verse, and even what Isaiah is quoting here, he's quoting one of the foundational verses for the Jewish people. One of the foundational verses for the Jewish people is in the call of Abraham, when God says to Abraham, your descendants are going to be numerous as the sands of the seashore and the stars of the sky. And so you would think, there are a lot of people that are the people of God, right? This is how big it is. And yet in the midst of that, in the bigness of all that God desired and wanted with the people of Israel, it's really only a remnant that's going to be saved. It's only a remnant that will understand Christ. It's only a remnant that will come to the Messiah. It will only be a remnant that will be made right with God. And then in verse 29, just again, another verse that reinforces this whole principle. Unless the Lord Almighty had left us descendants, we would have become like Sodom. We have been like Gomorrah. And so, again, talking like the only way that the Jewish people could have descendants is by the work of God. That but for what God would accomplish on their behalf, they wouldn't even be a people. And so again, when God is pointing to really the judgment that is on them, that they are more like Sodom and Gomorrah than they are like a righteous people, then we can't be surprised that God's disfavor is on them. And so there really is two parts to this as well. Do I have a slide on that? No. Oh, it's in my notes. That basically what the two sides here is, do they want to be part of the remnant or not? That as God reveals through the Old Testament that there will be a remnant. That's always the promise. Whenever you're going through a book in the Old Testament and it's talking about the discipline of God, God always, in expressing his wrath and expressing his judgment, says that, I'm always doing a work for you. I'm always trying to accomplish something through you. And there's always going to be a place of return, of redemption, of remnant, of me still working through a segment of these people to bring about my glory and bring about my purposes. And so therefore, there is a remnant of Jews even today, of those that desire God, that are following God, that come to Messiah Jesus in believing in him. And so as we see this passage, you're really, again, making us think just what our lives are oriented to. When we think about the control that is so important to us, and think about the times where you're upset, where you're stressed, when you're angry, when you're not at peace, and think about how those things are about you losing control. Losing control over circumstances, losing control over people, parents with teenagers, teenagers with parents. Again, control is a very important issue. But what this passage really calls us to is to bring ourselves under the sovereign hand of God and recognize that as we obey, as we follow, as we engage with him, we will find him to be the merciful, loving, and kind God that he is. And even as Paul goes on here, and we'll get to this next week, so it's important for you to tune in for really where he goes, because it really does get down to the choice that we have to hear God's call. And I think this is really where Paul brings back the free will, if you will. And as we're engaging with free will, we have to understand that God is still sovereign. As we're making choices, it's not the only choices that are substantive, that God is also making choices, but we are responsible to make choices. And so whether you are a believer in Jesus Christ, and this message is just a further emphasis of you engaging with God and following him and being comforted by the sovereign control that he has over you, over things, or if you're an unbeliever, to think about, again, what is going to draw you to Christ? That basically the message of the Bible is that Jesus came to pay the penalty for our sins, that Jesus came to be the bridge. He became the way that we could get to God. And he is the one who can actually save us from God's wrath. He's an expression of God's love and compassion, but he is the one that has borne God's wrath upon him, so we do not have to suffer that wrath. And so whatever it is that would draw you to Jesus, it's good reason to be saved. It's good reason to be established in a relationship with a God who does care, who is an authority, that is powerful, that is present, that is caring in terms of providing for our lives, particularly as, again, our lives seem to be spinning out of control. Let's bow and let's pray. Father, we just do come before you, and we're thankful for the kind of God that you are. We're thankful for just what this passage reveals about you, that you truly can be trusted, that there is a place that we have before you, and that place is under you, that place is believing you, that place is trusting you, that place is getting to know you more and pursuing a relationship with you. And so, Father, I just pray that even in this time where maybe that's more difficult, that we would find means to make that happen in terms of being in your word, being in prayer, just considering the work of the Holy Spirit in our lives. And so we're grateful for the time we've had together, in spite of what that might look like. It's in your Son, Jesus Christ's name, we do pray. Amen.